November 11, 1943. Dawn breaks over the coral sea, painting the horizon in shades of amber and crimson. The USS Essex cuts through Pacific swells with mechanical precision, her flight deck already alive with the thunder of Pratt Whitney engines warming in the pre-dawn darkness. Aviation fuel mingles with salt air as deck crews in colored jerseys swarm like clockwork figures around rows of Grumman F6F Hellcats and Douglas SBD Dauntlesses. The smell of coffee, real American coffee, black and strong, drifts from the galley vents. A small luxury that would soon become a symbol of abundance that Japanese defenders could scarcely comprehend. In 18 minutes, the first strike package will launch toward Rabaul, beginning another rotation in what had become America's relentless industrial symphony of war. This scene, repeated hundreds of times across the vast Pacific theater, represented far more than mere naval operations. It embodied the transformation of American industrial might into an unstoppable force that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of the Pacific War. The Essex-class carriers, with their revolutionary ability to maintain continuous combat operations around the clock, had introduced a new paradigm of warfare that struck at the very heart of Japanese strategic thinking. The genesis of this maritime revolution traced back to the attack on Pearl Harbor, when American naval planners realized that the age of the battleship had ended and the era of the aircraft carrier had begun. But unlike the smaller, more fragile carriers of early 1942, the Essex-class represented a quantum leap in capability. At 872 feet in length and displacing 27,100 tons, these floating air bases could carry up to 100 aircraft and sustain operations that previous generations of warships could never have imagined. By late 1943, the production lines at Newport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company were delivering these technological marvels at a pace that defied belief. The USS Essex herself had been commissioned on December 31, 1942, followed by the Yorktown in April 1943, the Intrepid in August, and the Hornet in November. Each ship represented not just naval power, but the mobilization of an entire industrial civilization dedicated to victory. What made these carriers truly revolutionary was not their size alone, but their operational philosophy. Previous carrier operations had followed predictable patterns: launch strikes, recover aircraft, retire to rearm and refuel. The Essex-class broke this mold by implementing continuous operations that Japanese defenders found psychologically devastating. Flight operations began before dawn and continued past midnight, with rotating air groups maintaining pressure that never ceased. The coffee that permeated every corner of these floating cities became an unlikely symbol of American abundance. While Japanese forces survived on diminishing rations of rice and fish, American sailors enjoyed 3 hot meals a day, fresh coffee around the clock, and a supply chain that seemed limitless. The aroma of brewing coffee became the backdrop to endless briefings, debriefings, and the constant shuffle of flight operations that kept the war machine running. Admiral Nimitz had recognized the potential of these new weapons early. In his assessment to the Joint Chiefs of Staff in September 1943, he wrote, "The Essex-class carriers provide us with the capability to maintain sustained offensive operations against enemy positions without the traditional limitations of range and endurance that have previously constrained naval aviation." This understated language masked a revolution in military capability that would reshape the Pacific War. For the Japanese Empire, the appearance of multiple Essex-class carriers operating in coordinated task forces represented a strategic nightmare that their war planners had never anticipated. Japanese doctrine, honed through years of conflict in China and the early Pacific campaigns, emphasized decisive battle and the concentration of force at crucial moments. The concept of relentless, round-the-clock pressure was foreign to their military philosophy. The first major demonstration of Essex-class capabilities came during Operation Galvanic, the assault on the Gilbert Islands in November 1943. Task Force 50, built around multiple Essex-class carriers, launched over 2,000 sorties in the first 3 days of operations. This represented more combat flights than many Japanese bases had seen in entire months of the war. Japanese Rear Admiral Keiji Shibazaki, defending Baitio Island at Tarawa, had boasted that his fortifications could withstand bombardment for 100 years. Yet the continuous pounding from Essex-based aircraft, operating in carefully coordinated waves, began dismantling his defenses within hours. His final radio transmission, intercepted by American intelligence, conveyed a sense of bewilderment. The enemy maintains continuous air attack with fresh aircraft every hour. Our anti-aircraft ammunition is nearly exhausted. The numbers told a stark story. During the Gilbert Islands operation, Essex-class carriers launched an average of 185 sorties per day per ship. Traditional Japanese carriers, by comparison, rarely exceeded 100 sorties per day and could not sustain such operations beyond 48 hours without extensive resupply. The secret to this operational tempo lay not just in the ships themselves, but in the entire support infrastructure that America had built across the Pacific. Fleet oilers could refuel carriers at sea, allowing operations to continue without returning to port. Ammunition ships provided endless supplies of bombs, torpedoes, and aviation fuel. Most importantly, replacement aircraft and pilots arrived in streams that seemed inexhaustible to Japanese observers. Lieutenant Commander James Flatley, commanding VF-10 aboard the Enterprise, which often operated alongside Essex-class carriers, described the psychological impact in his after-action report. The enemy appears increasingly reluctant to engage our formations. Their pilots seem demoralized by the continuous nature of our operations. Where once they pressed attacks home with typical Japanese determination, we now observe hesitation and premature disengagement. This demoralization was not limited to aircrew. Japanese ground forces, subjected to round-the-clock bombing and strafing attacks, began experiencing what modern psychologists would recognize as chronic stress disorder. The traditional Japanese emphasis on spiritual strength and battlefield endurance proved inadequate against an enemy that never slept, never paused, and never seemed to run short of aircraft or ammunition. The coffee brewing in Essex galleys became more than mere refreshment. It represented the industrial capacity that made continuous operations possible. While Japanese pilots flew on empty stomachs and diminishing fuel supplies, American aircrew returned from missions to hot meals, fresh coffee, and briefings for the next sortie. The contrast was not lost on captured Japanese aviators, who frequently commented on the abundance they observed aboard American ships. Captain Minoru Genda, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and one of Japan's foremost naval aviation strategists, later reflected on this period. We had planned for a war of decisive battles, where superior spirit and tactical skill would overcome material disadvantage. The Americans showed us a different kind of war, one where abundance and continuous pressure wore down our strongest positions like water eroding stone. The transformation in Japanese strategic thinking became evident in their defensive preparations throughout 1943 and 1944, where previously they had built forward bases designed to project power across the Pacific. They now constructed deeper fortifications intended merely to delay the inevitable American advance. The psychological impact of facing an enemy that operated around the clock had fundamentally altered their conception of what was possible in warfare. By December 1943, the Essex herself had steamed over 100,000 miles, and her air group had flown more than 8,000 combat sorties. Her coffee consumption during this period exceeded 15,000 pounds, a seemingly trivial statistic that nonetheless represented the abundance that made such operations possible. Each cup represented not just crew comfort, but the vast supply lines stretching back to American ports, the cargo ships that braved submarine attacks to deliver provisions, and the industrial base that could afford to provision a floating city with luxuries that most of the world considered unattainable during wartime. The impact extended beyond immediate tactical success. Japanese intelligence reports from this period, captured after the war, reveal a growing sense of helplessness in the face of American industrial capacity. One report to Imperial General Headquarters noted, "The enemy appears capable of maintaining intensive operations indefinitely. Our calculations of American industrial capacity appear to have been grossly inadequate." This realization began to permeate Japanese strategic planning. The concept of a negotiated peace following a series of costly American defeats, the foundation of Japanese war strategy, crumbled in the face of an enemy that seemed capable of absorbing losses and returning stronger than before. The continuous operations of Essex-class carriers demonstrated that America was fighting a fundamentally different kind of war, one based on overwhelming material superiority rather than traditional military virtues. The crews aboard these carriers understood their role in this larger strategic framework. Petty Officer First Class Robert Joe Foss, serving aboard the USS Lexington CV-16, wrote to his family, "We don't just fight battles anymore. We fight around the clock, every day, wearing down the enemy until they can't fight back. It's like working in a factory, except our product is victory." This industrial approach to warfare represented a uniquely American innovation. European military traditions, which had influenced Japanese thinking, emphasized decisive engagement and the concentration of force at crucial moments. The American approach, by contrast, applied industrial principles to military operations, continuous production, quality control, and relentless efficiency improvements. The coffee that fueled these operations became legendary among American forces. Unlike the ersatz substitutes used by Axis forces, American ships received regular shipments of genuine coffee beans. The Navy had recognized early in the war that crew morale directly impacted operational effectiveness, and small luxuries like quality coffee proved remarkably cost-effective investments in combat capability. Japanese prisoners of war frequently commented on this abundance. Captain Takeshi Maeda, shot down during a raid on Kwajalein and rescued by American forces, later wrote, "I was served real coffee aboard their ship. Better coffee than I had tasted in Tokyo before the war." This small gesture revealed more about American war-making capacity than any intelligence report. A nation that could provide luxury beverages to sailors in the middle of the Pacific Ocean possessed resources beyond our comprehension. The psychological warfare aspect of continuous operations extended beyond the immediate tactical situation. Japanese radio intercepts revealed growing concern about American capabilities among enemy commanders. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, former commander of the Pearl Harbor Striking Force, privately confided to colleagues that American operations represented a new form of warfare that our doctrine has not prepared us to counter. The Baidu transformation in Japanese military thinking accelerated throughout late 1943 and early 1944, where previously Japanese forces had emphasized offensive operations and decisive battle. They increasingly adopted defensive postures designed to exact maximum casualties from advancing American forces. This shift represented a fundamental acknowledgement that they could no longer match American operational tempo or material superiority. The Essex-class carriers had introduced concepts that would define modern naval warfare for decades to come. Their ability to maintain continuous operations around the clock established new standards for military effectiveness. More importantly, they demonstrated how industrial capacity could be transformed into sustained military pressure that wore down enemy resistance through sheer persistence rather than dramatic battles. By early 1944, the United States Navy was operating 12 Essex-class carriers in the Pacific, with more entering service every month. Each ship represented the mobilization of thousands of American workers, from the shipyards of Newport News to the aircraft factories of Grumman and Douglas. The coffee beans that supplied their galleys came from plantations in South America, processed in factories across the American Midwest, and delivered through supply chains that spanned the globe. This global integration of resources stood in stark contrast to Japanese war production, which relied increasingly on dwindling supplies from a shrinking empire. While American carriers enjoyed abundant provisions and replacement equipment, Japanese forces faced shortages that affected everything from aviation fuel to basic foodstuffs. The contrast was not merely quantitative, but qualitative. American forces operated with the confidence that came from knowing their supply lines were secure and their reserves virtually unlimited. The transformation in combat effectiveness was measurable and dramatic. During the first 6 months of Essex-class operations, American carrier-based aircraft achieved kill ratios exceeding 10.1 against Japanese opponents. This superiority resulted partly from better equipment and training, but also from the demoralization that continuous operations inflicted on enemy forces. Commander David McCampbell, leading the air group aboard the USS Essex during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, observed, "The enemy pilots we face now are not the same caliber as those we encountered in 1942. Continuous pressure has worn down their training programs, their supply lines, and their morale. They fight bravely, but they fight without hope." This erosion of Japanese capabilities accelerated as 1944 progressed. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot of June 1944 saw Essex-class carriers and their air groups destroy over 400 Japanese aircraft in a single day, effectively ending Japanese carrier-based aviation as a significant factor in the Pacific War. The continuous operations that had begun in late 1943 had systematically degraded Japanese training, supply, and morale to the point where their forces could no longer offer effective resistance. The coffee that had become symbolic of American abundance continued to flow, even as operations intensified. Crew members aboard the Essex consumed an average of 4 cups per day during combat operations. A seemingly minor detail that nonetheless represented the vast logistics network required to keep modern military forces effective. Each cup required not just coffee beans, but sugar, cream, water purification systems, and the fuel needed to power the galleys that prepared thousands of meals daily. Japanese strategic assessments from mid-1944, captured after the war, reveal the profound impact that continuous American operations had on their planning. One report to Emperor Hirohito noted, "The enemy's ability to maintain intensive operations without apparent limitation suggests that our fundamental assumptions about American war-making capacity were erroneous. Continuation of current resistance may prove futile." The implications extended beyond the Pacific War itself. The continuous operations pioneered by Essex-class carriers established principles that would influence military thinking for generations. The concept of sustained pressure, supported by abundant logistics and rotating forces, became a cornerstone of American military doctrine. The lesson was clear. Decisive battles were less important than the ability to maintain pressure over extended periods. This approach reflected deeper aspects of American society and industrial culture. The same organizational principles that had built transcontinental railroads and mass production factories now powered military operations across the world's largest ocean. The coffee that fueled late-night flight. Operations represented more than crew comfort. It symbolized an industrial civilization that could project abundance and comfort to the furthest reaches of the globe. As 1944 drew to a close, the impact of Essex-class operations extended far beyond immediate military success. They had demonstrated that modern warfare was as much about industrial capacity and logistics as about traditional military virtues. The continuous operations that had begun as tactical innovations had evolved into strategic weapons that systematically degraded enemy capabilities and morale. The crews who manned these floating cities understood their place in this larger transformation. They were not merely sailors and aviators, but representatives of an industrial democracy that could mobilize unprecedented resources in defense of its values. The coffee they drank each morning connected them to farms in South America, factories in the American heartland, and supply ships crossing dangerous waters to keep them equipped and fed. Japanese leaders, facing the reality of continuous American pressure supported by seemingly unlimited resources, began preparing for the final phases of a war they could no longer hope to win. The transformation in their strategic thinking, from offensive operations to desperate defense, reflected the profound psychological impact of facing an enemy that never paused, never tired, and never seemed to run short of men or material. The Essex-class carriers had proven that abundance could be weaponized, that industrial capacity could be transformed into continuous military pressure that wore down even the most determined opponents. Their 24-hour operations, fueled by endless supplies and supported by global logistics networks, represented a new form of warfare that emphasized persistence over drama, systematic pressure over decisive battle. In the end, the revolution represented by Essex-class carriers extended far beyond military tactics or naval architecture. They embodied the transformation of American industrial capacity into a weapon of war that could project power continuously across vast distances. The coffee that permeated their operations, abundant, hot, and readily available, became an unlikely symbol of the democratic abundance that made such operations possible. While enemy forces struggled with diminishing resources and growing desperation, American crews operated with the confidence that came from knowing their civilization's full weight stood behind them, ready to provide whatever resources victory required. The legacy of those continuous operations echoes still in the rhythms of modern military power, in the understanding that sustained pressure often proves more decisive than dramatic gestures, and in the recognition that abundance itself can become a weapon when wielded by those who understand its power. The Essex-class carriers had taught the world that in modern warfare, the ability to fight around the clock, sustained by unlimited resources and unwavering determination, could transform even the strongest defenses into memory, one sortie at a time.